what's going on, everybody? It's another episode of Film Streak. My name is Rob. What I'm doing is watching new movies, talking about new movies, and kind of breaking down what it is about movies that is interesting, that is creative, that is unique, and what it is that we like about movies, right? Whether it's the genres, the filmmakers, the stories, the characters, even the actors or just the talent involved. There's always something interesting about it, I think. That's just the way I look at films in general as an art form, is it takes so many minds and so many ideas to make something into just a finished film that there's always something interesting about them. So a lot of the films I want to talk about right now are films that I kind of saw over the summer of this year, 2024. I noticed there's a lot of sequels. And look, sequels have been around forever. They've been around for probably 40 years or so now, or more, really. But the way that sequels are kind of changing, I've talked about it in previous episodes, like the legacy sequels that are, I guess, reboots sometimes, or half reboots, or they're picking up with characters like 20, 30 years later. I think that's the thing that none of us really anticipated when sequels really took off, let's say like in the 80s and into the 90s. It almost seemed more of a novelty thing. And then to say, well, now we're going to come back to characters and stories that we kind of thought were done and were left alone or just kind of forgotten. And so some of the sequels here, they are tied into big decades-long franchises that have been around for a while, but others here are somewhat new and somewhat tangential. They're not really like direct sequels to something. So, like, for instance, A Quiet Place Day One, it's a sequel in terms of it's in the same universe of the first two films, but it doesn't involve any of the characters. Maybe one character overlaps. But And actually, it's not even a sequel. It doesn't take place after the first two films. It takes place before the first two films. So it's a prequel, I guess, technically. But it's just another addition to this franchise, right? Another one here is Deadpool and Wolverine, which also, you could say it's a Deadpool sequel. You could say it's sort of a Wolverine-Logan sequel, in a sense. It's also part of the bigger Marvel Cinematic Universe, so it's got ties in different things, and yet it does feel like a very self-contained story. Like, it doesn't feel like it's setting up anything new coming down the road in the next film or in the next couple of years. It feels like the way things end in this film, like that's kind of it. This Marvel thing will pick up somewhere else with some other character, I'm supposing. But Deadpool and Wolverine, it's another type of sequel, but also it's sort of a legacy sequel. We're picking up with Logan after, the last time we saw him, he died. So it's just a very unique way to kind of restart a story. Some others here, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes and Alien Romulus. These are films that are, those franchises go back to the 60s and 70s. And look, some of the entries in those franchises have been real hit or miss. Some of them not as good as others, but these films are at least showing us some new characters, showing us maybe a little bit of a different spin on some of the worlds that these films are set in. And I would even say doing a couple of new things, And then we have other films here that I've seen that I feel like are intentionally trying to start franchises, setting up sequels. I have Horizon Chapter 1, which clearly there's a Chapter 2 at least coming out. Supposedly there are 4 films in this saga that Kevin Costner has put together. Borderlands, which is based on a video game franchise, which has 3 games already and then a 4th game coming. This feels like it was maybe supposed to set up a film franchise, but based on the way this film turned out and then the reception of it, I feel like that's probably going to be a no-go. It's just, hey, quality is king, right? If your film is no good, we're probably not going to see more. And, the only film that is kind of an outlier in this group, at least, but I saw it over the summer here. It really is outside of all of this in terms of the genre and the story. It's not fantasy. It's not anything about superheroes or any kind of action, really. It's the Bikeriders. And I wanted to see this film because I feel like it involves talent that is in those other kinds of films. You got Tom Hardy, who's in Venom, who was in the Batman, what was it? The Dark Knight Rises. You've got Austin Butler, who I feel like is on the cusp, if not already involved in films like that. I mean, he was in Dune Part 2. I feel like he's going to be in something, one of these Marvel type franchises at some point or another. I think he's an actor who's not, I don't want to say above it, but I think that's well within his lane to cross into that territory and maybe do some really interesting work, right? And so that is a film that I feel like it is its own thing and is telling a very specific story, but I think it's got the makings of other things coming down the road. I don't know. It's just a sense I have. I could be wrong. But all of these films, it just occurred to me, it's like so many sequels, and yet I think for the most part, most of these films are pretty solid. A Quiet Place Day One, I enjoyed it for what it is. I didn't really feel like it was as novel as the first two films, specifically the first film, of course. That was such a unique take on the alien invasion horror film type of thing. The playing with sound or the absence of sound and what it takes to survive in a world like that, right? This film, we at least kind of see it from the start. We see people discovering, oh, these are the rules of this situation. And we see different characters than we've ever seen before. We're introduced to new people that, unfortunately, I think it kind of hurts the film in the sense like we know we're not going to see these characters after this film, just by nature of it being a prequel, and those characters didn't show up in the first two films. So going in, it's a little hard to feel so attached and to really, I don't know, root for these characters because it's kind of fruitless, like I kind of know where this is already going to go. It doesn't mean it can't still be entertaining, of course, but it does kind of tamper some of your experience, I think, right? And so then, if you go from that to Deadpool and Wolverine, where it really feels like there are no rules. Yeah, Logan died in the previous movie, so you can't bring him back. How would that work? And this movie just says, hey, screw it. We're doing whatever we want, which is the Deadpool style, of course, is we break all the rules. We break the fourth wall. We just refer to things that don't even relate to this character or this story. We talk about filmmakers. We talk about filmmaking. We talk about celebrities, popular culture. And all that stuff just gets thrown into the blender. And it nails it. It nails so much of the fun and the, the mischievous nature of this character and the type of story. And it is, I think it is ultimately kind of inventive. Now, it is there's a lot of fan service. There's a lot of like winking and like bringing up things that we haven't seen in a long time or things that we wish we would have seen. There are a lot of cameos. If you haven't seen the film by now, there are cameos from past characters in Marvel or Marvel associated films over the last, 30 years almost, whether it's X-Men or Elektra or Blade. A lot of characters show up that we kind of thought we'd never see again. And I think just that aspect of this film of not being so much about setting something up coming in the future for Marvel and those bigger, objectives there. It's more about looking back. It's more about reflecting on things that have happened and characters that we've known, and maybe some characters that we wish we would have been able to see more of, and to at least give us that and maybe just close the book on it. And so I think that aspect of that film really, if you've stuck with this long enough, if you've kind of been following this for all this time, for me, Blade was a real high watermark of like, wait, what is this? I think that was 1998 when that came out. And that was a moment where I said, this is something new. And at the time, I didn't even know it was based on a comic book character. I'm not that familiar with comics, really. But I knew like this was a very different take on a vampire movie and an action movie. And then to see different things that came afterwards and kind of cribbed some of the styles, some of the look of it, even some of the attitude of it. And then, of course, that started to really bring in this whole era of superhero movies. And we got the bigger characters. We got Batman again. We got Superman again. We got Spider-Man again. We got the X-Men. We got all these bigger franchises, bigger entities that really became reality on film. And I still, to my mind, I still kind of trace it back to Blade. And so to see a film now acknowledge that and nod to that and kind of send it off, I think that was really cool to see happen, You have to imagine there are people probably watching this film, Deadpool and Wolverine, that weren't even alive when Blade came out. This film I think it's working as also a bridge of maybe generations or audiences. It's like, hey, you never saw the Blade films? You got to go check those out. Somebody who's maybe 18 years old, those are old films to them, right? Keep that in mind. So then this film to say, there's history, go get schooled up, but also have a good time and let's make fun of it even. And it does have to have some kind of coherence. It can't just be a bunch of random gags. I think the film that really illustrates that in the opposite direction is Borderlands. I mean, it's a film that is based on a franchise that has a very devoted audience. And I think maybe rightly so. I mean, there's 3 games in that franchise. And then to take a film adaptation and, from my understanding, kind of ignore things about the game, even the cast, like they don't really seem to be the right fit for some of these characters. I think it's a disservice. And I'm sure for someone who really is into the games, it can probably even feel kind of like disrespectful. Like you're kind of ruining this idea by doing that. People have certain expectations. And if you just totally zag and also not even really make it a quality product, don't actually have a piece of work that captures the right attitude or the right style, or even tells a story that is relevant to the source material, it doesn't matter if the cast is good or not, right? I mean, I sat there watching it, and it did remind me of some of those video game adaptations in the early 90s, I want to say, like the Mario Brothers movie or the Street Fighter movie. Even the Doom movie with The Rock in it. And is like, people were trying, of course, they were trying to make this happen, but it's not easy. And, it even makes me think like there really haven't been any like grade A video game adaptations yet. I think the best we've done, and it is good, don't get me wrong. It's not, I'm saying it's the best of the worst. I'm saying it is actually good, is The Last of Us. I think for anybody who understands the games, that series really kind of captures it. And I only know a little bit about the games. I never played the games, but I kind of understand the story and the tone of it. So, but even outside of that, like not being familiar with the games, not having actually played and experienced the games, watching the series, it's still a well-done series all on its own. And so I think this is, Borderlands is just another one of those attempts to make this work, but it just shows how tricky it is. So if I go now to, let's say, Alien Romulus, that's one that, while it is a sequel, it is also a prequel. In the middle, like squarely in the middle of this Alien franchise, right? You've got, before it, in the timeline, you've got Prometheus, Alien Covenant, and Alien. Then after it, you've got Aliens, Alien 3, and Alien Resurrection, right? It's like dead center in the middle of this franchise. And, you know, the thing that, I enjoyed the film watching it, and I enjoyed that it kind of took things back to basics, right? It's basically another, you know, monster chasing you in a dark hallway. And that's what the first film was. And there are aspects of the others that kind of work that way, but you know, the two prequels that Ridley Scott did, Alien Covenant and Prometheus, they're ambitious. They're so ambitious. They have so many big ideas, like existential, like universe spanning questions and ideas in it. And I think that stuff is cool. And I want to kind of know more about that. I want to see what else would come of that. But it can get so big that you kind of forget that this is about people trying to survive with this monster chasing them. And, you know, and I would say the only thing I think with Alien Romulus is, I don't know if it really gives us, I don't know if it gives us anything necessarily new though. And so in that respect, I can see why it's like, if Ridley Scott was coming back to the franchise, it's like, I'm not just going to repeat myself. We got to add something to this. I got to get some other thing happening. This thing needs a different engine. I can't just use the same thing that I did in the original movie. And here, it kind of is that. And I say, even like the cast, I'm sure they're all super talented and they're all, you know, interesting performers, and they've done some interesting work. Kaylee Spaney, I know, is in some films here lately that I think are going to, I think she's going to become a much bigger presence, right? But the other casts, I mean, I think the strength of at least the first two films of Alien and Aliens was that you felt like these characters knew each other. And whether they got along or they didn't get along, they felt like real people who really were living this situation. And in this film, I never got the sense that these people, one, that they ever really cared for each other, but also that they weren't really even interested in like looking out for each other, like in the moment, you know? To the point where I cannot think of, aside from Rain, the main character, and Andy, who is her, I guess, synthetic companion / quote unquote brother, I guess, I cannot think of any of the other characters' names. I mean, they don't stick, right? I can remember them. I remember what happened to them and all that, but I can't think of their names. And it's like all these other movies, at least the first two movies, I mean, you can remember their names. You got Ash, you got Bishop, you got Dallas, you got Hicks, Hudson, right? I mean, Ripley, of course. It's like, you know their names. And maybe it's because, look, we sat with them for some time now. It's been decades. But with this film, I just feel like the cast, the characters, maybe more specifically, they were probably the weak link in the chain. That, and look, the whole Rook, CG, Ian Holm thing, I don't know how to feel about that. I like it as an homage, I guess, or kind of a callback to the first film, but I also think it wasn't really necessary. You know, if Andy could be an entirely different, I don't know, model or character, why couldn't Rook? Why did he have to be, digital Ian Holm? And, you know, some of the other little like nods and like references to other things in other films in the franchise, I thought they were nice as a fan, but at the same time, you could see the film working without it. And that's where I kind of started to turn on this film a little bit of like, I liked it in the moment. I thought, oh, that's from the other film where he does that. Okay, got it. Cool. That's nice. They know what they're doing here. They know the franchise. But none of those other films, any of the other 6 films in this franchise, none of them did that. None of them like pointed to each other. They were their own thing. They were very unique in that sense. And I think that's where I started to see like, here's the problem with these legacy sequels. I mean, you're doing some things for me who remembers the early films or the original films, but you didn't have to do that. Why not just focus on making your story more unique and maybe stronger in that way? So like I said, I still enjoyed the film. I still thought it was pretty good. It's not really at the top of the list in all of the franchise, but it's solid. I kind of feel like it could open something up for maybe another, I don't know, another installment somewhere. There is a series coming that I think takes place in a whole different part of the timeline, let's say. I feel like it was good enough, but I don't know that I'm going to really revisit it anytime soon. Maybe if I do like a franchise kind of rewatch or whatever, but it's good enough, I think. If you're a fan of the franchise, you won't be so disappointed, I hope. I mean, you notice I haven't mentioned the other 2 sort of films in this franchise. It's because I really don't consider the Alien versus Predator films part of this, and I think they are just kind of cash grabs, honestly. That, and they're not actually very good, so I just don't count those. This one, I feel like it earns its place. It's not really among the worst of the films, but it's not at the top either. And even with Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, it's kind of a similar thing. Like, it's not as good as maybe a couple of the earlier films, like back from the 60s or 70s, but it's also not as good as the more recent sequels. It's somewhere in the middle. And yet I think what it does do, whether it's good or not, or whether you enjoy it or not, it at least adds some more context to this story, right? This whole saga of how apes became smart and took over the planet, and now humans are the animals in the zoo, basically. And I say that because the last film that we saw, War of the Planet of the Apes, the way that film ends and the characters and their situation, there's a pretty sizable gap between that and the first film, the very first film with Charlton Heston, right? There's a gap in that timeline. So this Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes really helps to fill that in a little bit. And, it kind of tries to have it both ways of like, well, the apes have taken over. Humanity is pretty much nearly extinct. But then it tries to do a couple of things to turn that by the end of the film. I don't know. So I feel like there's got to be more here. We really, when it looks like, oh, humanity is kind of on its last leg, and then we find out it's actually really not. Well, I mean, does that mean we get another film where we really do see that happen? Where we do get to the point where, the people are just in cages and the apes are the ones ruling the show? I feel like there's another film possibly. So, with those in mind, the other films that I saw here, Horizon, it's very much a different lane, right? It's not this science fiction, fantasy, superhero kind of stuff. But yet I feel like it's just, or even more immersive and tactile than those films. And I've really kind of searched for the right way to talk about it because I feel like it's so ambitious. I mean, the idea of like, this is just the first film in this saga, and it's already 3 hours long. And you have to presume the next 3 films will probably be the same. Like, this is serious. This is a giant, just a massive story that Kevin Costner is trying to put together here. And in that regard, it just feels like, why wouldn't this work better as a limited series, right? Why wouldn't this be something that Apple TV would have, or I don't know, Max or whatever streamer, right? Except for, I think this plays so much better on the big screen. Like sitting and watching this in a theater, not just the landscape and everything, but just the, like I said, just the immersion of it. Of like, there are so many little things, little touches, little details, little moments, whether it is not even about the characters or their stories. We got like three different plots happening in this film, right? There's three different threads. One of them is in, I think, Montana, and then another is in Arizona, and then another is like in Oklahoma. And we're seeing all these different characters making their way west, basically, trying to settle the frontier and the struggles that they have, and dealing with natives and dealing with each other. And you have to assume at some point, and I think it's kind of hinted, that all these things, all these characters are going to converge somewhere, presumably Horizon, which is this little settlement that gets a rocky start, can't really kind of find its footing, but it does become like a central location in a way. But in the middle of all that, there are all these little touches in scenes, in moments, in just single shots, where it's like, it reminds you, or at least indicates, how hard life was back then in that part of the world, right? And I think that's something that it's easy to overlook because it's nothing we understand today. Modern America, contemporary society, we don't understand those things. You live in the city, hell, even if you live in a rural area, you don't really live like that. You don't have to do and deal with the things that people had to deal with back then. And so I just thought it was really interesting that this film, this story, didn't like just gloss past those things. It didn't just ignore those things. It showed us, like, you know, there are things you have to pay attention to, whether it's the weather, whether it's where you're going to eat, what are you going to eat? And, you know, the whole thing with the wagon train, with Luke Wilson and his character being kind of the leader of this wagon train, these settlers moving across, I think they're moving across Oklahoma, like through Texas, and them having to deal with like, oh, here's why the wagons are breaking down, because of the heat. It's destroying the wheels on the wagons. How are we going to fix this? Right? Or like, hey, you have water. It's all of our water. It's not your water. It's for all of us. And until we find water again, we got to make this last. You know, is that sense of like community, that sense of ruggedness, and that sense of that determination of like, well, we have to survive. This is not like luxury time. I don't know. I found so much of that interesting to see, and I don't want to say be reminded of, because I think most of us in modern America have never had to live like that. But I know that there was a time that was the way of life, and it's not even as far back as the 1800s. It could even have been just 60, 70 years ago. So I think it's doing some really interesting things, and I'm curious to see where it's going to go. I think everybody in the film, cast-wise, is doing solid work. Even Jamie Campbell Bower, who I think gets a little cartoony, but he has some really interesting moments. I mean, there's a scene where his character and Kevin Costner's character, they don't know each other, and yet they're going to the same house for two different reasons. And they just happen to be walking in the same direction, and they start up this conversation, and it's a very tense, kind of awkward conversation. But you know, as an audience member, if like, oh, one's going there to kill somebody, one's going there to maybe sleep with somebody. And that somebody happens to be the same person, right? And so the whole time, this is probably like a 5, maybe 10-minute sequence. And you're following this conversation, and you're seeing one is a motor mouth and the other one just doesn't want any part of it. And yet you don't know where it's going to go. You don't know how it's going to end up. And it's a really interesting way to kind of build tension when you know who both of these characters are and you know both of their objectives, and yet they are not saying it to each other. So you're just waiting for fireworks now, right? And it's a subtle thing. It's not, it's not big on action and it's not very dynamic, I don't think, but it does feel grounded. It does feel authentic. So I think it's doing some really interesting things. I would like to see what happens in the next installment. I mean, this film also does an interesting thing where at the end of the film, we kind of get like a sort of an action shootout type scene towards the end. And then right after that, we go into this kind of montage. And it's not clear at first, like, wait, what happened? What are we doing now? But what it is we're basically seeing a sort of like a mini trailer or an extended trailer for the second film. Because we're seeing characters we haven't seen yet. And we're seeing situations and settings that we haven't seen. And yet it's playing out as if, well, this is clearly something that's going to happen. And so I think that was an interesting way to do it. I feel like the only time I've seen that happen elsewhere was in, I think it was Back to the Future 2. Because those, Back to the Future 2 and Back to the Future 3, they filmed together or like right after each other, one after the other. And so when part 2 came out, I remember going to see that in the theater, and there was that little short montage at the end of the film, basically hinting of like, hey, look, here's what we've already cut together from the next film. Like, don't forget, come back in a few months or whatever it was. And it was interesting because we were seeing these characters in a whole different setting, in a whole different situation. And so to see that approach, I mean, of course, look, they want people to see the first film and see the second film and whatever comes after that. So I just thought it's just baked into the film though. It's not like a post-credit thing. It's not a mid-roll or anything like that. It's like right in the film. It's basically the last scene of the film is this montage. So I feel like there are a couple of touches here that I think are more interesting than I expected. I really kind of thought, well, all right, Kevin Costner's kind of done the big epic Western thing, Dance with Wolves, Open Range, Wyatt Earp, it's kind of been through that territory a few times now. But here, I mean, I'm glad that his character is not the only character, is not the main character. There are several different characters that have their own stories going on at the same time. So I'm curious if that will stay. Maybe that will change in the next film. I don't know, but I think I came away more pleased than I was maybe puzzled by anything. What I am puzzled by, I think, is the sort of release structure or strategy of this. I mean, the part 2 was supposed to come out in mid-August, I think, and that got delayed or got canceled or whatever. And now part 1 is already on streaming on Max. So, what does that mean? Will we get to see chapter 2 in theaters, or will it go straight to streaming now? And what does that mean for the other 2 films, right? What does that mean for the rest of the story? I don't know. It's so ambitious, and I appreciate that. I appreciate the giant swing that this is. And so the last one here, I think really the Bikeriders is one that it's not really a big swing. It's not very fantastical, and it is actually a pretty small story, but I think it's a story about real people and a real moment in time that has influenced and affected so much that has come after it. It's about these guys that have this motorcycle club and how that maybe starts as just some buddies and working class people that just do this, ride their bikes in their time off, and how that becomes more of an organization, how it even starts to factor in, like the criminal element starts to become a part of it, how it becomes essentially like a motorcycle gang. I know that's not, I guess, the preferred nomenclature, but I'm just saying, right? Like that we see aspects of that. And the fact that it's all based on real people, it's based on this photographer who kind of just documented and interviewed these real people in this book. And I feel like pretty lovingly I feel like pretty lovingly has been captured in this film, to the point where, honestly, I think it's a little over romanticized, you know, this culture, the personalities here, because there is a point where things turn violent, things turn dangerous. And I feel like that is something that should be a turn. And yet for the characters, for the film, it never really seems to be like, oh wait, these guys are becoming bad people now. They're making really horrible decisions. And I feel like that doesn't get acknowledged quite as much as I thought it would. And yet, you know, I can understand it's a little bit rose-colored maybe, you know. I mean, we're trying to represent this specific time and this way of life. Sure, I get it. I do think it does that well. You know, it's something that I've always had a fascination with. I've never had a motorcycle, never ridden a motorcycle. And it's not even about doing that necessarily, but just that sort of, I don't know, kind of counterculture, kind of rebellious type of way of living or way of seeing the world. I get that. I'm down with that. But when it starts to turn bad, when it starts to turn sour, like how do you reconcile that, you know? And at least ultimately, I think the performances in here are pretty solid. You know, Jodie Comer, who's in this, puts on a pretty thick Chicago accent. And I don't know if that's accurate or not. It feels a little too accenty compared to everybody else in the film. But otherwise, I mean, I think she does a great job. She really kind of holds the film together. She is the one that is telling this story of what happened and these guys in this club. Austin Butler is kind of the, the loose cannon, the young hotshot. Tom Hardy is the older guy who is kind of in charge of things, but also kind of, you know, is willing to let people do their thing until it starts to catch up with him, right? And so I feel like that's where we have enough dynamic nature to the characters and their relationships, and I'm sure that's based on the real thing, but it at least makes for a pretty interesting portrayal of all of this. So ultimately, all these films, I mean, this was a pretty big summer. I mean, not only the other films I've talked about in previous episodes that I've watched this summer, but these I tried to see all in the theater, except for what did I not see in the theater? Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes and the Bikeriders. I think everything else I saw in the theater, and I was pretty pleased with, you know, and that's something that, you know, I remember thinking about that last year in seeing a lot of older films like Alamo Drafthouse or whatever theaters were doing, you know, special screenings of things. It's like, I want to make sure I see films in the theater. But the ones here that I saw in the theater, I think these are the ones that stood out as really solid experiences, you know? I mean, aside from Borderlands, I guess, I enjoyed all of these. I enjoyed the level of work, the quality of the work, because it shows. I mean, you can't deny it on a giant screen. So anyway, that's it for me for this episode. If you want to find some other episodes, you go to filmstreak.com. You can sign up there to get a new episode by email, including this episode, including the next episode, and so on and so on. You can also subscribe with Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all those things. And, you know, look, I also have a list of all of these films on IMDb. So go do that. Go add these to your list or go find out where you can watch them right now. And, you know, look, summer's almost over here. So things are starting to cool down, I hope. If not, you know, hey man, a nice dark theater works like a charm. So go do that. Go watch something new.